You've got to get up pretty early in the morning to speak to America's hardworking farmers and food producers. We should know. FLM Harvest is a strategic, full-service creative consultancy proud to reach more farmers, farmer boards, and food and commodity associations than any agency in the country. And we understand omni-channel as well as we understand the journey from field to fork. Most importantly, we connect clients to the audiences that matter to them.
Thank you for joining us for our Agri-Pulse Washington Week interview. I'm Spencer Chase, joined as always by Agri-Pulse Executive Editor Phil Brasher, discussing the week that was, agriculturally speaking, in Washington, D.C. And in Washington, D.C. this week, we got started early. Sunday was supposed to be a day of rest, a day of leisure for us, and all of a sudden it was a day of following a Twitter account. President Donald Trump came out and announced that he was going to be levying tariffs, increased levels of tariffs on Chinese goods to the tune of about 25% on about $200 billion worth of Chinese products. Keep in mind, this is after a week of talks that the administration had just had in China. At first, they announced those talks as productive. There's been some reporting come out since then that said the Chinese really were walking back a number of the provisions that they thought that they had previously settled or at least discussed in some of these trade negotiations. So after that tariff announcement, there was a big kind of a will they or won't they to the discussions, whether or not the Chinese delegation would even show up, and if they did, who would come from China. And we know now that the Vice Premier on trade matters from China is in Washington. We're recording this on a Thursday afternoon, and Thursday evening they're supposed to sit down for some discussions into Friday and potentially over the weekend as well. And so, Phil, we know that they are negotiating. What kind of a backdrop are they negotiating against?
Well, certainly the president has sent mixed signals, shall we say, over the last few days. We were just talking, he's sort of playing bad cop, good cop, and sometimes the same conversation. So really keeping things off balance, to say the least. I think one of the things I've been struck by this week is the actual fairly muted reaction from Capitol Hill, at least from Republicans and certainly from Democrats. The Senate Democratic leader, Chuck Schumer, has made pretty plain that he supports the president and is pushing him in that direction of being tough with China. Don't settle for a halfway deal. But importantly, on the Republican side, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, which has responsibility for trade policy, and that's Chuck Grassley of Iowa, of course. He was fairly supportive of the president. He said he wasn't worried about the threat of higher tariffs since it appeared that the Chinese would, as they have, show up for this latest round of talks.
Mm-hmm. So the Chinese are in Washington for another round of talks, and President Donald Trump speaking this afternoon, expressing some optimism that there's still hope for a somewhat speedy conclusion to these talks. A reporter asked him if a deal could get done this week, and he said, yeah, it could. Whether or not that will actually happen, we'll be a lot smarter on this subject a week from now than we are right now. But something to watch kind of in the next couple of days and into the weekend is how the United States and China emerge from these negotiations, not only in terms of actual tactical tactical language, but also just from a position of negotiating posture.
Yeah, and this can only go on so long. There is a lot of concern out there in farm country that we continue to hear that lawmakers are heard about again today over in the House, about the trade policy, about the way this uncertainty and these tariffs are weighing on the farm economy and the commodity markets, obviously. You can only go so far into a presidential election year with this still hanging over rural America.
Mm-hmm. And we haven't even talked about USMCA yet. And
right.
If you want to talk about trade issues in rural America, there's another layer to that conversation. But speaking of rural America, a lot of folks in that part of the world have really been looking to Capitol Hill and wondering what's going to happen in terms of a disaster assistance package to help producers in the Southeast impacted by 2018 hurricanes, and now producers in the Midwest impacted by 2019 flooding. And Phil, should we just run the clip that we ran last week of saying that this discussion is stalled and they hope to pass something before Memorial Day?
That's where things stand. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is saying that he wants this bill. This bill's got to be passed by Memorial Day. That means there's 2 more weeks, and I could easily see this playing out certainly through next week. We still have the standoff over Puerto Rico. The White House also wanted border security money put in there, and there's this other dispute. It's actually inter-Republican dispute between the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Richard Shelby, and the White House over opening up the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund to spend more money out of that for infrastructure projects. The White House is pushing back. Shelby wants to get that money out there. This is actually sort of an installment on infrastructure. He wants to get that money out to get work done on ports. We'll see how that's just one of the issues that's holding things up right now.
Mm-hmm. So things still blocked a little bit. Not much in terms of real tangible progress on that front. The House did consider a bill this week. They voted on the rule on it today, and continue action on that next week, I would suppose, on kind of disaster bill of their own making as well.
Yeah, that's. The House is just more or less sending a message here, kind of keeping the pressure on Senate Republicans, but this really has to be settled over in the Senate. Once the Senate gets a deal, moves and can pass that, this will go through pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. And I want to wrap up this week talking about something that happened just here this afternoon, just across town over at the Economic Research Service headquarters in Washington. And our own Steve Davies was on the scene for the vote of ERS employees deciding that they would like to unionize by a pretty wide margin. I believe the final vote was 138-4. And so I imagine there's 4 fairly lonely people over at ERS right now. But Phil, this is something, this decision to move the Economic Research Service and National Institute of Food and Agriculture is something that's been weighing pretty heavily on almost every ag policy decision, really since August, when Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue announced his intention to do so. But 138-4 vote has got to send a bit of a message on just where ERS employees feel on the subject.
Yeah, it sends a message not only to Agricultural Secretary Perdue, but also to Capitol Hill about the anxiety, unhappiness at ERS about this plan to move the agency, or most of the agency and their economists out of D.C., either to Kansas City, Raleigh-Durham, or Indiana. Those are the 3 finalist sites that the Secretary says he's going to pick from. So we'll see. The Secretary is determined, has made clear that he's determined to move forward with this, but there could be still some twists and turns, and certainly this is one of them.
Mm-hmm. More to come on that subject as the final announcement of just where the Department of Agriculture plans to move these agencies and these employees expected to come relatively soon. The move expected to happen not that far after, but I imagine Capitol Hill will want to have something to say about that as well.
Well, depends on when this happened. They may not have much to say about it, unless, and I think it's going to be very difficult to get the Democratic-controlled House and the Republican-controlled Senate on the same page on this. The only question would be if somehow if Secretary Perdue needed more money out of Congress, he would have a tough time doing that, I think, at this point. Mm-hmm. But if he can get it paid for other ways, maybe he can probably move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, stay tuned on that subject, folks. We'll be sure to keep you up to date. I would encourage you to stay tuned to Agri-Pulse.com for the coverage that our own Steve Davies has been doing on this subject, as well as the coverage that is yet to come as we continue to follow this issue, as well as the China negotiations, the disaster bill, a whole host of other issues that we're following here at Agri-Pulse.com. I think that's going to do it for this week. So for Phil Brasher, I'm Spencer Chase. Have a good one.